Hi, I'm Melanie McFarland, and welcome to Salon Talks. And today I have the pleasure of being in conversation with Elvis Mitchell, film historian and critic, whose new documentary, Is That Black Enough for You, is currently streaming on Netflix. Hi, Elvis. Great to have you here.
Thank you for that introduction. I was wondering who are you talking to, historian and critic? I want to meet for a new documentary. My gosh.
Well, I mean, you're being silly. I mean, obviously, this is a one of the first examinations of the 70s and 70s Black cinema that I've seen that's really taken context, put it in context to the whole of cinema and also the whole of Black cinema from the beginning of the medium. And also putting it into the view of the reasons that it was so influential and also overlooked. So I have a lot of questions, obviously, but what I want to start with is what was the impetus for making this documentary?
Well, exactly what you just said a moment ago. I felt like offering that kind of framing for this really exciting and I think explosive and also, by the way, commercially successful period of filmmaking had gone wildly overlooked. I remember, and I've told this a couple of times before, so forgive me, but a friend, when the book Easy Riders Raging Bull came out, I just thought, well, and I said to him, well, it should be really interesting to see how he places black film in that context during that period. And he goes, well, there's no black people in the book. Oh, of course there's no black people in the book. And and another thing that really forced this for me is at one point I was talking to a guy who ran Warner Brothers in the early 70s, who I quote, talking about Superfly, and he said, listen, the dirty little secret of American cinema is that it was financed by black film in the 70s. And, the thing I'd say we should remember is that Shaft kept MGM from bankruptcy at the time they were auctioning off portions of the lot and Dorothy's ruby slippers and all these artifacts that people thought they would keep forever. Shaft came through and was this breeze that I think a real sort of hope for the movie business, but also a great and fascinating time for film that, to the point you made in your introduction just a moment ago, Melanie, just wasn't getting it to do. And I don't know why that is. Actually, unfortunately, I know exactly why that is.
I was going to say, I hope have some theory because I'm going to ask you about that. But first, I'm going to ask you about the fact that you originally, I had read, envisioned this as a book. Is that correct? Am I correct in this?
Yeah, I was imagining it to be a book. And I thought, well, again, to go along with books such as Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, and Mark Harris's great look of the year, film year 1968, Pictures of the Revolution. And I thought, because again, as you were saying, there's just not been an examination of this period in phenomenological terms, in artistic terms, in so many ways. I mean, it's when you hear it mentioned, it's usually the word that begins and ends the conversation is blaxploitation,
Yes.
as if that's all there were. And also the associations that blaxploitation that we get from that just well, it's campy and it's silly and it's not to be paying attention to it. We should dismiss it. And I just think this is a period that shouldn't be dismissed. That as we so often that when that kind of thing happens, it does damage to us as a culture, I think. But it's also a way of just ignoring the impact that filmmakers of color, black actors and actresses, black musicians had on the medium. And I think we do that at our peril, and we do it too often.
But it also creates a division, and this is something that I became aware of when I was watching this, is that, I grew up in the 80s and I grew up in a very media literate household. And one of the things that my mother in particular wanted us to do was to see great Black films, but she also distinguished, because she was raising, she's showing this to her children, some of the most seminal films of the 70s I didn't see until I was an adult because it had this connotation of blaxploitation about them. Sweet
Wow.
Sweetback's Badass Song, one of the, there's several of these movies. I didn't see Shaft until I was much older, and Shaft was a mainstream movie. Now that wasn't her fault. I think it was more of an idea of, sound, like films like Sounder and even Lady Sings the Blues, and those movies I think were seen as these are the, or anything with Sidney Poitier, in it, or Harry Belafonte. These were the movies that were Black cinema. So that must be interesting to kind of bring this into the current age. After all that, my question to you is, what do you think that blaxploitation means in 2022?
I think it's still a reductive way to deal with the period. It's categories like saying urban music, or one of the things that makes people immediately come up with a box in which to fit this kind of thing. And it's that incredible thing you're saying about the way you grew up. What I wanted to do is show that there was a universe of Black film being made in that period, and that they were all part of the same tapestry, really. I never separated them, because growing up the way I did, all these things were available to see. So you could go see Sound and then see The Spook Who Sat by the Door and see Superfly, and actually watch actors move back and forth. Antonio Fargas was one of the interview subjects, is in Across 110th Street, but he's also in Cleopatra Jones. And then he's in the Paul Mazursky film, Next Stop Greenwich Village. I mean, so just to see these actors, basically plying their trade and growing in their craft, and that was fun to spot too. And if these actors weren't making distinctions about the kind of movies that they were in, then why should I? And that really became this eye-opening point of view for me, and think, well, if these guys don't look down on it, I won't either. And it's still become a kind of watchword for me, just to kind of follow the talent. And that's one of the things I tried to do with this documentary.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the documentary format suits the telling of this, the exploration of this history better than having it as a book?
Well, given that people said no to the book, I'm going to say yes, absolutely. Documentary much better than books, because otherwise I'd still be waiting to do it. Let's not kid ourselves here. Nobody wanted this book from me. So go ahead.
I've got to say, I find it odd that this, well, maybe you should answer this question for me. Was it easier to get it made as a documentary than it was to get it made as, ultimately, you got it made as a documentary, but was the experience of getting it to the phase of getting the green light on it, did it seem like it was a shorter distance than getting it made as a book?
I'll give you a long answer. No, it wasn't easier. It was just because I would mention to somebody, and not even trying to pitch it, because I'm no good at that, as clearly the last 23 years have shown. But I would just kind of mention it, and people would go, "Ah, that sounds really interesting. My Uber is here, so I'll catch up with you later." And so I had done a Q&A event with Steven Soderbergh, and we were just having a conversation after. And he said to me, "So what exactly is it you're doing with your career anyway?" And I just, well, it's sweet. You think I have a career. There's this thing I've been trying to do. And he goes, "Well, that's a great idea. And I know where this is going. I'll get the check so we can go." And he said, "No, this is a great idea. I can cash flow this for you." And this is 4 years ago now. And I just said, "Oh my God, that's great. I have no idea what that means." He goes, "I can finance it. But let's go set it up someplace so you can make a living, and we're not just financing it and selling it so you can make money after the fact." We go and have a couple of meetings. And at one meeting, somebody just turns away from me and goes, "So, Stephen, when are you going to have time to make this movie?" Because this is the before times when we realized that Black people can make movies about themselves.
The before times of 2018.
Yes, 2018, yes, way back then, before the pandemic. And he just looked and said, "Why would you think I should direct this? He's sitting right here." And so he just, said, "Do you know David Fincher?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Let's get David and take this over to Netflix." And Fincher says, "Oh, I know why you couldn't get this made, because it's about a bunch of Black people. So let's go make it." It took that. It took these guys getting behind it and getting it set up. I started thinking, just going to do these things I tell people about. Maybe one day I'd self-publish it or start doing it as a series of missives on Instagram or something. That it turned into this thing with resources behind it and Netflix behind it is still unreal to me.
And then we also have the example, one of the things that you brought up is the fact that, these films were marketable, made money, and in one case saved a studio. You have the example of Black Panther coming up, and, all these different people saying, "See, Black films and films making about Black," I see you wrinkling your nose, but my point being.
My point is, when you say that, when 4 years ago, when the first Black Panther came out, people were saying, especially after it became so successful. This is going to change everything. And I said,
No.
no, 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 it's not. Some way, it will be defined as sui generis. It's a Marvel movie. It's a sequel. It's part of the Avengers metaverse. Some way or another, there will be people saying things that will prevent imitations of it. And this year we finally got the Woman King
Mhm.
and the sequel to Black Panther, and that's it. So
Mhm.
I wasn't. It wasn't what you were saying, because I love what you're saying, but I wish, but you take me back to the film with success should beget success. And when it comes to projects from people of color, it often does not.
Mhm. And not only that, I mean, to your point, like there were so many narratives and people were talking about the fact that this is an example and going back and saying like, this is how much money is being left on the table by not, making films that tell stories of not just Black folks, but people of color. This is all this money that's being left on the table. Um, and one of the things that I think that your documentary does really well is show, after all of this prolific output, all of these influential titles, at the very end, it's the whiz that's pointed to as like, well, these films don't make money, and then it just kind of disappears. But you see the influence, which must so what does that kind of do to the argument, or for the argument of like, look, here's this entire decade of filmmaking that is referenced by many white filmmakers, many TV auteurs, and you have recent box office successes that say, like, speaking of the Woman King, it made much more than it was expected to. Still modest by modern standards, but much more than it was expected to open. um what do you think that this kind of may do for giving a broader market, and opening the doors for more Black creatives and more Black films in the future?
I think incrementally there have been some changes, certainly, but we still, and maybe the interregnum between these cycles are getting smaller. But you'll have a bust like The Wiz, which had it just got bad reviews and made money, people will look the other way, because Superfly and Shaft didn't get great reviews, but they were money makers, so people kind of held their noses and went along with it. But when there's this bust, there's always this kind of thing of, huh, well, we tried, but we don't know how to get Black audiences out. And it leaves certain facts out, like the African American audience, and for that matter, the Latinx audience,
Mhm.
spends disproportionately on entertainment in ratio to its part of the population. So that you would ignore that and leave that money on the table, as you said. Well, you think about the Moneyball philosophy. You can go to the World Series hitting singles and doubles, and clearly the Woman King is a solid double. You put another runner on base and another runner on base, that's a home run eventually.
Mhm.
But now the philosophy is about this kind of elephantiasis, this gigantism that
Mhm.
really the Wiz was part of, and got sucked into that kind of sargasso, and become the excuse to not make any more movies. So by 1986, we get She's Gotta Have It. And then 87, 35 years ago this year, we get Hollywood Shuffle, which, as much as anything, the filmmakers were talking about the way they had to hustle to get the movies made. So that becomes the story as much as the fact that they're Black films, because as Melvin Van Peels would tell you, if you don't give people something else to write about, it's just a Black film. You get the patronizing pat on the head and, oh, you made a movie about Black people. Well, we wish you well with that. So it's always been about this spirit of entrepreneurship. When these cycles happen again, then in the early 90s, there was one. And then they go away. And then the late 90s, there's Black romantic comedies. And then those go away. And when Black films come back, as often as not, the story is Black films are back. It's like, but they didn't go anywhere. No, but Black films are back. They didn't go anywhere. I see what you're saying. But Black films are back. So it's that somehow, I guess, becomes about you and me trying to change the way that narrative is positive, because so much of Black culture, in terms of the way it's covered in this country, is binary. Either it's there or it's not.
Mhm.
There's no complication in the story, and that's the sad truth.
Mhm. So this movie is coming on around the same time as, sadly, one of my favorite series, TV series, Atlanta, is ending. And I don't know if you watch Atlanta, but there was a recent. Oh, okay. Well, some people don't want to make any assumptions.
The
But
mockumentary.
the recent episode, The Goof by the Door,
The
the
mockumentary. Yeah,
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 the
yeah.
mockumentary, um, was so excellent in terms of the marvelous episodes in the entire series. But all these little homages, not just to the spook that sat by the door, but also Putney Swope, all of these things within that particular episode were just genius. And when I was thinking about that while watching this, I'm curious to know from you which TV creators, filmmakers are carrying forward the legacy that was established in the 70s by um by all these great filmmakers that you feature here.
I think you just mentioned what Donald Glover is doing, what he's doing it across media. He's not just doing it in television, he's doing it in music video, he's doing it in music. This idea that Black culture is all connected. It's what Issa Rae was doing. It's what James Samuel was doing. It's so many filmmakers are doing this now. It's what Genie Prince Bythewood was doing, for goodness sakes. It's just that there was a time when, I think independent film was looked upon as being this viable resource. And by the way, so many people come from that. There's Ava DuVernay who got her start in independent film. There's Dee Rees. I mean, I could sit here and just, the more we talk, the more names I can come up with. And I feel like in the last few years or so, we have this kind of collective wave of conscious filmmaking, conscious storytelling that includes all these touch points. I got to tell you, I was thrilled when I saw the episode of Atlanta because it's like, my God, it feels like there's something in the water now. But that there's a Sidney Poitier documentary at the same time that this is out. At one point in this film, I had a scene that we just had to lose for time about Louis Armstrong's impact on mainstream film. That you go from Louis Armstrong to Bing Crosby, who he got high with and taught how to get high. And the Bing Crosby example going to Dean Martin, who was doing Bing Crosby, then Bing Crosby to Dean Martin to Elvis Presley. Even seeing the movie Elvis and seeing Sister Rosetta Tharpe in that made me think, well, gosh, these things all kind of surface often simultaneously. But when they go away, rather than try to replicate them, as in the case of Black Panther, and isn't that puzzling that didn't send people like shuffling around through all their portfolios looking for other pieces of IP so that they could try to do something like that with? But that even goes back to at one point Stan Lee and Jack Kirby saying that the character when he was created in 1965 was inspired by Sidney Poitier. So
Mm.
there's a continual conversation, and I love that so often, especially in Insecure and in Atlanta, and these really magnificently long range and long form pieces of storytelling. They don't leave movies out. They don't leave music out. They understand that people don't just watch movies or watch TV or listen to music, that we all do all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned Sidney Poitier. I want to go and talk a little bit about just some of the things that I know after interviewing a lot of documentary filmmakers, that particularly when you're working with any kind of titles that are may not be circulating as extensively as others. Were there any particular films? Were there any particular pieces of archival footage that were difficult or impossible to get in order to make this? And then related, were there any interviews that you had wanted to, get as part of the documentary that you weren't able to?
There's certainly a few interviews because we were supposed to start shooting in earnest May of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
You got news about it back where you're from, that we had this pandemic here on the West Coast. And certainly there were people in their 80s and 90s who went, I like your idea. I don't think I want to risk my life for it. But I found out what happened was the film sort of contracted and expanded to fit where it needed to. Um, there certainly were some pieces of archival footage that just weren't in good enough shape to show. And that becomes the issue, too, of how Black film is treated. That, if there's nobody around to archive this stuff, to make a digital internegative and restore it, then you just can't use them. And there's a litany of those I could recite, but I don't want to I try to concentrate on the stuff that we did get, because I have to tell you, my editor found that piece with Dr. King talking about movie theaters that just took the top of my head off. because that speaks to so much about how movies are bigger than just being for movie nerds or movie freaks. I mean, if you grow up as a person of color and in a small southern town, and you get a third run movie probably playing in a former warehouse or possibly a grain silo, some area that wasn't meant to be a movie theater, and this barely being held together. In fact, probably the same prints I was trying to find, the literal same print I was trying to get into this movie. It just shows you how the imagination is not served and how the audiences aren't met. I mean, it's when black audiences come out and the studios think they'd rather go after Germany in the 1940s than make movies for black people. I mean, there's so much about this kind of bed of inertia that really is this physical force that institutional racism is part of.
So this leads into, I want to, this isn't spoiling anything, but it's such a great quote because I wanted to talk to you about it. It's the very last quote in the movie that you say, being Black in America is often about remembering that what you think you are isn't what other people see and figuring out the distance between those two perceptions. So how do you think that the films of this era really crystallize that for you?
First of all, I'm glad you watched till the end, just so you actually could pull it out. Dear, you almost reduced me to tears here, golly.
I'm just quoting you back to you. That's all.
Well, you threw it pretty hard at the duck. I couldn't get my mitt up in time. But you just mentioned Atlanta in that last episode. But what Atlanta does every season is there's an episode that I think fundamentally asks that question between, and just Paperboy's name in the first episode, you kind of go, wow, that's funny. And it's satiric and honest because it doesn't seem that far from reality that somebody could call himself Paperboy in the world that gives us a rapper named Lil Baby. So, it's like, how far away is that? And so that these storytellers are constantly asking these kinds of questions. I think The Harder They Fall, they did that too, because it sort of said, and this was a kind of a thread that runs through the documentary, people talking about Western, Sam Jackson saying, I would like to have had a black cowboy, and Suzanne DePass saying the same thing, and even Charles Burnett. And it's not that there weren't black cowboys, but there would be a black Western that was also like Harlem on the Range, a Western. It's also a murder mystery. It's also a screwball comedy. That's also a melodrama. I mean, those filmmakers had to pack these things in because they never knew when they get to do another. But now, in the case of Atlanta, or what this was doing with Season from Season to Insecure, where it's about that neighborhood and the way people dealt with that neighborhood and that iconic neighborhood where I live, as a matter of fact. I'm in Leimert Park, not far from Baldwin Hills and View Park and Inglewood. And the reactions people have just those names being evoked and what that does to them. I think that there's a constancy of people working in that level of self-awareness in ways that are explicit now that they wouldn't have been before. I mean, in that period, you had Bill Greaves doing it with Symbiote Psycho Taxi Plaza, which is an astonishing film, a great piece of filmmaking, a film that's completely aware of the presence of having a person of color who's the discomfort that he causes, the director being a black person, is never even addressed directly, but it's there. And for my money, you can't look at that movie and not see the impact it must have had on somebody like Sacha Baron Cohen, or to bring it back to a full circle into your question, to Eric Andre, who's also dealing with that question of being a person of color and not talking about it, but being a person of color who's also kind of really a bebop improviser, and what that does to people who won't acknowledge that, but are still afraid that that's part of who and what he is. I think and that's such a great question. I'm glad you asked that, because I think it's extant in a way that it hadn't been before, and people can take or leave it at their pleasure. But I think it even exists in music, and I think it goes back to the relationship a lot of rappers had to these movies, because growing up, these was kind of the exemplars of black manhood that they saw. You'd be hard pressed to find a rapper of a certain age who wouldn't talk to you about the education of Sonny Carson and that sequence we have in the movie where he's being jumped into the gang. They went, yeah, well, I know what that's like.
Well, I can ask one more question here. Seems like we're coming to the end of our time, and thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time today. What do you think is the least understood about Black films and filmmaking in the 1970s that you hoped to dispel with Is That Black Enough for You?
That's, what we were talking about before, that there was only one kind of film being made, and that film was in effect a joke, something to not be taken seriously. Because I make the point that even when I saw Three the Hard Way, what seemed like a laughable premise, imagine putting a chemical that would kill all black people. Who could think about that? And my father saying to me, when the movie's over, "You don't know about the Tuskegee experiment, do you?" I went, "The experiment on Tuskegee?" And he explained to me, "Oh, so this is a action adventure film that's based on a piece of black paranoia that makes all the sense in the world." I mean, that there are so many different kinds of films, and even the films that were dismissed as black action films, as blaxploitation, had a lot more going on in them than meets the eye or the ear. In the case of something like Superfly, where you have a soundtrack that not only is in character but responds to everything that's happening in the screen. I mean, there's just a richer and more satisfying artistic movement that took place in that period than was ever thought of before, except by people of color.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I hope people watch this documentary as a gateway to seeing these movies.
Yeah.
And I hope that they become much more findable as a result of this documentary too. They're pretty easy to find now, but I hope that we get to see more of them. You know.
Yeah, there's some, I think it's been mentioned to me that a few of them are a lot of them, in fact, are turning up a Criterion. So
Mhm.
you Criterion channel, by all means, do that. And yes, please, these movies are well worth your time. And I have to thank you too for a great conversation too. These are terrific questions.
Thank you so much. Well, everybody go watch. Is That Black Enough for You on Netflix? It's streaming right now. Thank you, Elvis Mitchell.
Thank you.